Hakata Bay. The first sensation is the sound, a monstrous, inhuman groan that is not of the earth or the sea, but of the sky itself tearing apart. The wind does not howl, it shrieks, a solid wall of pressure that flattens the waves into a churning, white chaos and rips the very air from a man's lungs. Then comes the rain, not as drops, but as horizontal spears of freezing water, blurring the world into a gray, violent smear. On the decks of the largest invasion fleet ever assembled, there is no order, only a symphony of terror. You smell the pitch boiling off the straining timbers, the acrid stench of vomit, and the metallic tang of fear sweat mixed with salt spray. The colossal 9-masted flagships of the Yuan fleet, marvels of Chinese engineering designed for calm rivers, are being lifted and smashed down like children's toys. You hear the sickening crackle of splitting masts, a sound like the breaking of a giant's bones, followed by the percussive roar of a hull splintering against another in the maelstrom. Men, Mongols, Urchins, Koreans, and Chinese, who had conquered a continent, are now just screaming cargo, sliding across decks slick with rain and blood, their hands raw from clinging to ropes that whip and snap with lethal force. The light is a pulsating, ghostly twilight, the sun obliterated by a bruised, purple sky. Below, in the chaos, a samurai on the shore, his armor lashed by the gale, can only watch as the sea itself does his work. He feels the vibrations through the soles of his feet as another vessel, a floating fortress moments ago, is pulverized on the rocks, its death scream swallowed by the storm. This is not a battle. It is an execution. This is the end of an emperor's grand obsession, the final deafening answer to a demand for surrender. This is the saga of the divine wind, the Kamikaze. And the moment the unstoppable Mongol tide was not just stopped, but utterly, apocalyptically, broken. This is the narrative of him, Kublai, the fifth great Khan of the Mongol Empire, the grandson of the world conqueror Genghis and the Emperor Shizu of the Yuan Dynasty. To understand this man, we must stand amidst the wreckage of his grandest ambition and ask the question that haunted his final years. How? How could the heir to the most terrifying and efficient military machine in human history, a man who completed the conquest of China, a feat that had eluded even his grandfather, who commanded the resources of a quarter of the globe and the manpower of hundreds of millions, fail so completely, so catastrophically, not once but twice, to conquer a small, remote island nation? This was not merely a military defeat. It was a cosmological crisis. It was a direct challenge to the very idea of the Mongols' heavenly mandate to rule the world. The paradox of Kublai Khan is the story of a man who stood at the absolute zenith of human power, who could order the movement of 100,000 men with a flick of his wrist, yet found himself utterly impotent against the fury of the sky and the obstinance of an island people. Was it a failure of strategy, a miscalculation of logistics, or was it something deeper? Was it the fatal flaw of hubris, the belief that his will alone could bend the laws of nature? Was it the internal rot of an empire that had grown too vast, too complex, too far from the harsh purity of its steppe origins? To unravel this mystery, we must journey back, not just to the storms of Hakata Bay, but to the very world that forged Kublai Khan, a world trembling under the shadow of the Mongol eagle, where all nations and all kings were being weighed in the balance. To understand Kublai, we must first understand the world he inherited, a planet held in a Mongol fist. The mid-13th century was not an era of competing empires. It was the era of a single world-straddling colossus, and everyone else was merely reacting to it. In the West, the aftershocks of the Mongol invasions were still palpable. The principalities of Russes were shattered vassals, their princes crawling to the Golden Horde's capital at Sarai to beg for their patents to rule. The Teutonic Knights, fresh from their crusades in the Baltic, had felt the sting of Mongol tactics at the Battle of Legnica, a warning that the true power in the world did not reside in European chivalry. The Kingdom of Hungary had been ravaged, its fields burned, its population decimated. Even the heartlands of the Islamic world had been broken. In 1258, Kublai's brother, Hulagu, had sacked Baghdad, the intellectual and spiritual center of the Abbasid Caliphate, extinguishing a flame that had burned for 500 years and rolling the caliph in a carpet to be trampled to death by horses. The Mongol hordes had reached the shores of the Mediterranean, checked only by the Mamluks of Egypt in a desperate battle at Ain Jalut. This was the macro level, the geopolitical chessboard on which Kublai made his moves. His world was one where Mongol dominion seemed not just inevitable, but divinely ordained. His grandfather, Genghis Khan, had been granted the mandate of heaven to punish the wicked and unite the world under one sky, and the evidence was everywhere, from the plains of Poland to the banks of the Indus. Yet, in the East, the great project remained unfinished. The wealthy and sophisticated Southern Song dynasty in China, a civilization of unparalleled cultural and technological achievement, still resisted, a defiant bastion of Chinese identity south of the Yangtze River. And beyond them, across the treacherous sea, lay the final, tantalizing prize: Japan, the islands of the rising sun. In this world, conquest was not a policy. It was an identity. It was the natural state of being for a Mongol Khan. For Kublai, sitting in his new capital, looking out over his vast domains, the existence of an independent Japan was not just a strategic annoyance. It was a philosophical impossibility, a flaw in the universal order that had to be corrected. The character of Kublai Khan was forged in the crucible of a profound contradiction, the clash between the nomadic steppe and the settled civilization, between the legacy of the warrior and the education of a scholar. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan, the personification of the steppe storm, a man who famously declared that the greatest happiness was to scatter your enemy, to drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, and to take his wives and daughters. This was the blood that ran in Kublai's veins, the ancestral curse and blessing of the Borjigin clan. Yet, unlike his grandfather, Kublai was not raised solely in the saddle, smelling of horse sweat and leather. He was the son of Tolui, Genghis's youngest, and his mother, Sorghaghtani Beki, was a Nestorian Christian princess of the Karat tribe, a woman of remarkable intelligence and foresight who understood that brute force alone could not sustain an empire. She ensured that Kublai and his brothers, Monka, Hulagu, and Arik Boke, were not just warriors, but were also educated. Kublai, in particular, was drawn to the sophisticated cultures his people were conquering. He spent years in northern China, not just as a conqueror, but as a student. He surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, Buddhist monks, Confucian scholars, and skilled administrators who taught him the intricate arts of governance, taxation, and bureaucracy, concepts alien to the Mongol way of life, which was traditionally organized around the hunt and the raid. This created a deep duality in his soul. One part of him was the Mongol Khan, expected to be ruthless, decisive, and ever-expanding. The other was drawn to the life of a refined emperor, a patron of the arts, a builder of cities, a sage king who ruled through wisdom and order. This internal conflict would define his entire reign. He was a man who tried to ride two horses at once, the untamed stallion of his Mongol heritage and the disciplined, gilded steed of Chinese imperial tradition. This psychological tension is the key to understanding his obsession with Japan. For the Mongol warrior, it was simply the next target. But for the aspiring Chinese emperor, it was a necessary component of the celestial world order, a tributary state that had to acknowledge his supremacy to validate his claim as the true son of heaven. Kublai's first significant step onto the world stage, his first independent command, was the campaign against the Dali kingdom in modern-day Yunnan province, starting around 1253. This was no mere raid. It was a masterclass in calculated strategy and a profound revelation of the new kind of Mongol leader he was becoming. The Dali kingdom was a remote mountainous land, difficult to access and culturally distinct from the Chinese heartland. A traditional Mongol approach would have been one of lightning cavalry charges and overwhelming, brutal force, leaving a trail of destruction as a warning to others. This was the way of his ancestors, but Kublai did something different. He implemented a pincer movement of breathtaking scale and complexity, sending one column south through the treacherous mountains of Sichuan while he personally led another. But the true genius was not in the military maneuver itself, but in the political strategy that accompanied it. Instead of wholesale slaughter, Kublai offered terms. He sent envoys ahead, demanding submission but promising clemency. When his envoys were executed, he had his casus belli, yet even in his righteous anger, his response was measured. He instructed his generals, most notably the brilliant Subutai's son, Uryankadai, to minimize bloodshed. The chronicles report that after the capital was taken, Kublai forbade the massacre of the population, a shocking departure from the established Mongol terror tactics that had leveled cities like Samarkand and Kiev. He understood that the goal was not just to conquer, but to incorporate. He wanted the resources, the manpower, and the legitimacy that came with ruling a functioning state, not a smoldering ruin. The conquest of Dali was a microcosm of his future reign. It demonstrated his strategic acumen, his willingness to use diplomacy, and his revolutionary understanding that a conquered people could be an asset rather than just spoils. It was a stunning success, securing his southern flank for the eventual war against the Southern Song and earning him immense prestige within the Mongol elite. But it also revealed the Chinese side of his thinking, a preference for strategy and administration over pure, unadulterated conquest. This was the first time the world saw that Kublai, son of Tolui, was not just another Mongol warlord. He was playing a far more complex and sophisticated game, a game that would eventually win him the throne of China, but also set him on a collision course with the unyielding samurai of Japan. Beneath the veneer of the wise administrator and the pragmatic conqueror, a powerful, hidden motivation drove Kublai Khan, a deep-seated obsession with legitimacy. This was his inner demon, the psychological engine behind his relentless ambition. He was, after all, only one of many grandsons of the great Genghis Khan, and the Mongol Empire was a fiercely competitive family enterprise where power was never truly secure. His claim to the title of Great Khan was not universally accepted. It would, in fact, be contested in a bloody civil war. He needed to prove, not just to his rivals, but perhaps to himself, that he was the true and rightful heir to Genghis's legacy. However, his interpretation of that legacy was radically different from that of the Mongol traditionalists. For them, the heart of the empire was the steppe, the yurt, the nomadic lifestyle, and the shamanistic sky god Tengri. power was demonstrated through martial prowess and the loyalty of the Mongol hordes. But Kublai saw a different path to ultimate authority. Having immersed himself in Chinese culture, he became captivated by the concept of the Mandate of Heaven, Tianming. This was a philosophical and political idea far more sophisticated than the steppes' simple creed of conquest. It posited that the ruler of the Middle Kingdom, the emperor, was the Son of Heaven, a universal sovereign with a divine right to rule all under heaven, Tianxia. This mandate was not just won by force. It was demonstrated through virtue, justice, and the ability to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. For Kublai, this became the ultimate form of legitimacy. To be a mere Khan of the Mongols was a limited tribal title. But to be the Son of Heaven, the emperor of a restored and unified Chinese empire, was to achieve a status that was absolute and universal. This ambition explains his every major decision. Moving the capital from Karakoram to Dadu, Beijing, adopting Chinese administrative systems, and even taking on the dynastic title of Yuan. And it is the absolute key to understanding his fixation on Japan. In the grand cosmic map of the Chinese world order, Japan was a known, albeit peripheral, part of the system. For it to refuse to acknowledge his supremacy by sending tribute was not a simple political slight. It was a direct refutation of his claim to be the universal emperor, a glaring imperfection in his mandate of heaven. The conquest of Japan, therefore, was not just about territory or wealth. It was a metaphysical necessity, the final, crucial piece required to validate his entire political and spiritual project. The single most fateful encounter in Kublai's life, the one that defined his path and set the stage for both his greatest triumph and his most devastating failure, was not with a person, but with a civilization. China. His deep and prolonged engagement with Chinese culture and its elite advisors was the fulcrum upon which his destiny turned. While his brother Mungke ruled as Great Khan from the traditional Mongol capital of Karakoram, Kublai was granted viceregal authority over northern China. It was here that his transformation accelerated. He actively sought out and cultivated a circle of Chinese advisors, men like the brilliant administrator Liu Bingzhong and the Buddhist monk Haiyun. These were not sycophants. They were representatives of a civilization that had perfected the art of empire building over millennia. They taught him that power was not just about cavalry. It was about canals, granaries, tax revenues, and a loyal bureaucracy. Liu Bingzhong, in particular, was instrumental in shaping Kublai's worldview. He helped design his first capital at Xanadu, Chengdu, according to traditional Chinese principles of cosmology and feng shui. More importantly, he was the chief architect behind the grand design for the new imperial capital, Dadu, the Great Capital, on the site of modern-day Beijing. The decision to move the seat of Mongol power from the windswept plains of Mongolia to this ancient Chinese metropolis, undertaken in 1272, was perhaps the most significant act of his reign. For the Mongol traditionalists, this was an act of apostasy. It was an abandonment of the ancestral lands, the graves of their fathers, and the Spartan, warrior ethos that had made them strong. It was, in their eyes, a surrender to the soft, corrupting influence of the civilization they had conquered. But for Kublai, it was a masterstroke. It placed him at the heart of the wealthiest, most populous, and most administratively advanced region of his empire. It gave him access to the vast resources and skilled manpower of China, tools he would need to finally crush the Southern Song. This move won him an empire, but it came at a terrible cost. It created a permanent rift within the Mongol world. solidifying the split of the great empire into separate, often warring, khanates. He became the emperor of China, but in doing so he ceased to be, in the eyes of many, the true great Khan of the Mongols. It was this dual identity that would both empower and ensnare him, giving him the ships to attack Japan, but also imbuing him with an imperial arrogance that would lead him to disaster. The ascent to ultimate power was, for Kublai, not a smooth succession, but a brutal, fratricidal struggle that would cost him dearly. This was the price of the throne, paid in the blood of his own family. The great game truly began in 1259, when his brother, the great Khan Mongke, died unexpectedly during a campaign against the Song in Sichuan. The news of Mongke's death triggered an immediate succession crisis, a recurring poison in the Mongol political system. According to tradition, a Kurultai, a grand assembly of Mongol princes, was supposed to be held in the homeland to elect the new great Khan. The leading candidates were the two youngest brothers of the deceased Khan, Kublai and Arik Böke. Arik Böke was in the capital, Karakorum, supported by the Mongol traditionalist faction, who were deeply suspicious of Kublai's pro-Chinese leanings. They saw Arik Böke as the true heir to the nomadic heritage of Genghis. Kublai, however, was on the front lines in China, commanding a powerful, seasoned army. In a brazen and decisive move, Kublai convened his own Kurultai on Chinese soil near his capital of Xanadu in 1260 and had himself proclaimed Great Khan. It was an act of sheer political audacity. Arik Böke's supporters in Karakorum responded by holding their own Kurultai and electing him Great Khan. For the first time, the Mongol Empire had two rival leaders, and a devastating civil war, known as the Toluid Civil War, became inevitable. The conflict raged for 4 long years, tearing the empire apart. It was a war of logistics and legitimacy. Arik Böke controlled the heartland, but Kublai controlled the immense agricultural and economic resources of northern China. Kublai's armies, a mix of Mongol, Jurchen, and Chinese troops, systematically cut off the supply lines to Mongolia, slowly starving his brother's faction into submission. By 1264, Arik Böke was forced to surrender. Kublai was merciful, sparing his brother's life but purging his key supporters. Though he had won the throne, the victory was hollow. The war had shattered the unity of the empire. The leaders of the Golden Horde in Russia and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia had either supported Arik Böke or remained neutral, and they never fully accepted Kublai's authority afterward. The Mongol Empire was now a single entity in name only. It had fractured into 4 de facto independent khanates. Kublai had secured his power, but in doing so he had broken his grandfather's legacy of a united world empire, a sin for which his future failures would seem to some a karmic punishment. As Kublai consolidated his rule in the East, a formidable and fundamentally different antagonist was watching from across the sea. This was not another steppe warlord or a decadent Chinese dynasty. It was the Kamakura shogunate of Japan, a society built on a foundation of unyielding military discipline. The true power in Japan at this time did not lie with the divine but politically impotent emperor in Kyoto. It was held by the shogun, a military dictator in the city of Kamakura, and even more so by the regent from the Hojo clan, who ruled in the shogun's name. In 1268, when Kublai's first envoys arrived, the man in charge was Hojo Tokimune, a young, resolute, and deeply serious leader who had been groomed for power since birth. He was a devout practitioner of Zen Buddhism, a philosophy that emphasized discipline, mental fortitude, and a calm acceptance of death. This was the psychological bedrock of his leadership and of the entire warrior class he commanded, the samurai. The samurai were a unique phenomenon, a caste of professional warriors for whom martial prowess was a spiritual calling and death in battle was the ultimate honor. Their code, later known as Bushido, prioritized loyalty, courage, and a profound contempt for surrender. This was a mindset utterly alien to the Mongol way of war. The Mongols, for all their ferocity, were pragmatists. They accepted surrender, incorporated conquered peoples into their armies, and used terror as a calculated tool to break an enemy's will. For Hojo Tokimune and his samurai, surrender was not a strategic option. It was a spiritual failure, a stain on one's honor and the honor of one's ancestors. Furthermore, Japan was not a continental power. It was an island fortress, protected by what its people called the Ocean Moor, a stretch of notoriously violent and unpredictable water. This geography had bred a sense of distinctness, of sacred separation from the mainland. When Kublai's letters arrived, addressed to the King of Japan and demanding submission to the Great Khan as a vassal, it was seen not as a political demand, but as a sacrilegious affront to the gods who protected the land. Tokimun's response was a calculated and defiant silence. He did not deign to reply. He understood the message for what it was, a prelude to invasion, and he began one of the most extensive military preparations in Japanese history, ordering the construction of coastal defenses and mobilizing the samurai clans from across the country. The stage was being set for a clash of civilizations, not just of armies. It would be Kublai's pragmatic continental empire against Tokimune's unyielding island of warriors. The first catastrophic miscalculation, the fatal mistake that sowed the seeds of the ultimate disaster, came in the autumn of 1274. Fueled by Japanese defiance and imperial arrogance, Kublai Khan launched his first invasion. From the shores of Korea, he dispatched a fleet of some 900 ships, carrying an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 men, a combined force of Mongols, Jurchens, Chinese, and a large contingent of Korean soldiers and sailors pressed into service. On paper, it was a formidable force, equipped with the composite bows, tactical discipline, and terrifying reputation of the Mongol war machine. The invasion force made short work of the islands of Tsushima and Iki, perpetrating brutal massacres that sent a shockwave of terror toward the mainland. When they finally landed at Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu, the main island of Japan, the initial encounters revealed a shocking clash of military cultures. The samurai, accustomed to ritualized single combat where warriors would announce their lineage before engaging, were bewildered by the Mongol tactics. The Mongols advanced in tight, disciplined formations, shielded by large pavises, firing poisoned arrows in massive volleys and using gunpowder-filled ceramic shells, what the Japanese called teppo or iron thunder bombs, that exploded with a deafening roar, terrifying the Japanese horses and sowing chaos. The samurai fought with incredible bravery, but they were being pushed back. Yet the Mongol victory was not decisive. The command structure of the invasion force was deeply flawed, a triumvirate of a Mongol, a Chinese, and a Korean general, likely plagued by internal rivalries. Furthermore, they had underestimated their enemy. The samurai, though initially shocked, were far from broken. They were inflicting casualties, and their numbers were growing as reinforcements arrived. As night fell after the first day of fighting, the Mongol commanders, perhaps worried about being outnumbered in a prolonged land war and running low on arrows, made a fateful decision. They re-embarked their troops onto the ships, intending to regroup and plan the next day's assault from the safety of the bay. It was then that the heavens intervened. During the night, a ferocious storm descended, what the Japanese would later call a divine wind. The gale smashed the hastily assembled Korean-built ships against the shore, sinking over 200 vessels and drowning an estimated 13,000 men. The once proud invasion fleet was shattered. The surviving commanders had no choice but to gather their remaining ships and limp back to Korea in a humiliating retreat. For Kublai, the news was infuriating. He saw it not as a sign from the gods, but as a temporary setback caused by weather and incompetent command. He had understood that Japan was defiant, but he now failed to grasp the deeper lesson, that the sea itself was his enemy, and that the samurai spirit was not so easily broken. The humiliating failure of the first invasion did not deter Kublai. It enraged him and hardened his resolve. But before he could seek his revenge on Japan, he had to complete the grand project his grandfather had begun: the total subjugation of China. The Southern Song dynasty, despite having lost the north decades ago, remained a formidable power. It was a wealthy, populous, and technologically advanced empire, protected by the mighty Yangtze River and a powerful navy that controlled the southern waterways. The war against the Song was a long, grinding affair, a world away from the swift cavalry campaigns of the open steppe. It was a war of siegecraft, naval battles, and attrition. The decisive moment came in 1273 with the fall of the twin cities of Xiangyang and Fancheng after a grueling 5-year siege where Mongol engineers, including Persian experts, employed massive counterweight trebuchets to pulverize the city walls. The fall of this strategic gateway opened the path to the heart of the Song Empire. Kublai's brilliant general, Bayan, a man of Mongol blood but deep understanding of Chinese strategy, led the final campaign. It was an overwhelming display of power. In 1276, the Song capital of Lin'an, modern Hangzhou, one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the world, surrendered without a fight, and the boy Emperor Gong was taken captive to Dadu. The final remnants of the Song resistance held out at sea for 3 more years, their fate sealed in 1279 at the apocalyptic naval battle of Yamen. Faced with utter defeat, a loyal Song minister, Lu Xiufu, took the 8-year-old child emperor in his arms and leapt into the sea, followed by hundreds of thousands of officials, soldiers, and civilians in a mass suicide of dynastic loyalty. With this final, tragic act, the Song dynasty was extinguished. For Kublai Khan, this was the moment of his greatest triumph. He had succeeded where Genghis had not. He had unified all of China under his rule, a feat of conquest on a scale almost unimaginable. And with this victory came a colossal prize: the entire administrative apparatus of the Southern Song, its vast wealth, its technological expertise, and most importantly, its massive shipyards and its thousands of skilled sailors and naval craftsmen. The chaos of the Song conquest had created a new, terrible opportunity. The path to Japan, which had seemed so difficult in 1274, now looked clear and certain. He now had the resources of the entire Chinese continent at his command. His second attempt would not be a mere raid. It would be an armada of overwhelming, world-conquering force. By the year 1280, Kublai Khan had reached the absolute zenith of his power and glory. He was no longer just the great Khan of the Mongols. He was the Emperor Shizu of the great Yuan dynasty, the undisputed master of all China, ruling from his magnificent capital of Dadu. This was the climax of his life's work, the moment of his greatest triumph. His empire stretched from the frozen tundra of Siberia to the jungles of Vietnam, from the shores of the Pacific to the borders of Eastern Europe. The Silk Road, now entirely under Mongol control for the first time in history, was safe for travel and trade, creating a period of unprecedented commercial and cultural exchange known as the Pax Mongolica. Merchants like the Venetian Marco Polo, who served in Kublai's court, could travel from Italy to China and marvel at the wonders of his domain. The bustling cities, the vast network of canals, the use of paper money, the efficient imperial postal system that could cover 250 miles in a day. Kublai presided over a court of incredible diversity and sophistication. He was a patron of the arts, commissioning grand architectural projects like the White Stupa in Dadu, designed by a Nepalese artist. He was a patron of science, establishing an observatory and supporting advancements in astronomy and cartography. He showed a remarkable tolerance for different religions, welcoming Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christians, Muslims, and Taoist priests to his court, playing them off against each other, but allowing them all to flourish under his rule. He had created a truly cosmopolitan world empire, a fusion of Mongol martial power and Chinese administrative genius. From his throne in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, he could look upon a world that trembled at his name. His armies were feared, his wealth was legendary, and his authority seemed absolute. The world had never seen a single ruler command such a vast expanse of territory and such a multitude of peoples. This was the culmination of the Mongol dream, the realization of Genghis Khan's vision of a world united under one sky. And it was from this dizzying height of unparalleled power that he once again turned his gaze eastward across the sea to the one small nation that still dared to defy him. The psychology of absolute triumph is a dangerous crucible, and from its fires, the monster of hubris is often born. At the peak of his power, Kublai Khan, the Emperor Shizu of Yuan, fell victim to this ancient human failing. He began to believe in the inevitability of his own destiny, to see his unbroken string of successes not as the product of strategy, sacrifice, and circumstance, but as a clear and unambiguous sign of divine favor. The conquest of the Southern Song, a task that had stymied the greatest Mongol generals for decades, was complete. He, Kublai, had succeeded. He had unified China. In his mind, this was the ultimate confirmation of his mandate of heaven. The gods had chosen him, the Borjigin clan, to rule all under heaven, and the evidence was undeniable. From this perspective, the embarrassing failure of the first invasion of Japan in 1274 was no longer a cautionary tale. It was reinterpreted as a minor, insignificant anomaly. It was a fluke, a freak storm, a result of incompetent Korean shipbuilders and bickering generals. It was not, it could not be, a reflection on his own judgment or a sign of celestial disapproval. How could it be? He was the chosen one, the Son of Heaven. His will was an extension of the divine will. This conviction, bordering on megalomania, blinded him to the stark realities of the challenge he faced. He dismissed the reports of Japan's formidable preparations, the coastal walls, the mobilized samurai, the focused, unified will of a nation preparing for a death struggle. He ignored the quiet warnings from some of his more pragmatic advisors, who questioned the wisdom and cost of a second amphibious invasion, a notoriously difficult military operation, even under the best of circumstances. He believed that sheer numbers, the overwhelming weight of the resources of his continental empire, would simply crush the island nation. The gods who had delivered him the vast and ancient empire of China would surely not deny him this small, defiant archipelago. His triumph had warped his perception of risk, making him confuse his own desires with the laws of the universe. This hubris, this arrogant conviction in his own destiny, would become the fatal psychological flaw in his grand design, leading him to craft a plan for the second invasion that was based not on sound military strategy, but on the simple, arrogant assumption that his victory was preordained. The personal drama at the heart of this geopolitical conflict was crystallized in the figure of Kublai's sworn enemy, a man he never met, but whose defiance fueled his obsession, Hojo Tokimune. While Kublai commanded a world empire, Tokimune's world was the compact volcanic archipelago of Japan, yet his will was as unbending as any emperor's. After the first invasion failed, Kublai did not immediately resort to force. He tried diplomacy again, sending a new set of envoys in 1275. He believed that the terrifying demonstration of Mongol power, even in a failed attempt, would surely bring the dwarf pirates to their senses. But he had fundamentally misjudged his opponent. Hojo Tokimune was not a pragmatist in the Mongol mold. He was the embodiment of the samurai ethos, a leader who understood that to show even a hint of weakness or compromise would be to invite destruction. He saw the world in stark, binary terms: submission or death. When Kublai's envoys arrived in Kamakura, Tokimune had them taken to the beach at Tatsunokuchi and publicly beheaded. He sent their heads back to the Mongol court, a message of shocking and unambiguous contempt. He repeated this act with another set of envoys in 1279. This was more than a political statement. It was a personal insult of the highest order, a direct challenge to Kublai Khan's authority and honor. For the great Khan, the ruler to whom princes and kings from across the world came to pay homage, this act was unforgivable. It transformed a strategic objective into a personal vendetta. The defiance of this young, obscure Japanese regent became a black mark on Kublai's imperial prestige. He could not let it stand. The execution of his emissaries, sacred and inviolable figures in Mongol tradition, was a casus belli that demanded a terrible and overwhelming retribution. The chemistry between the two men, separated by the sea, was one of escalating pride and intransigence. Kublai's imperial arrogance met Tokimune's unyielding warrior spirit. Tokimune's brutal actions left Kublai with no room to maneuver, no way to back down without a catastrophic loss of face. He was now trapped by his own imperial dignity. He had to invade, not just to complete his world order, but to avenge the blood of his messengers and to erase the intolerable stain of this personal humiliation from his otherwise perfect record of conquest. Driven by his wounded pride and the conviction of his mandate of heaven, Kublai initiated one of the most ambitious and terrifying logistical operations of the medieval world: the construction of a second, invincible armada. This was reform and construction on a continental scale, a testament to the raw power of the Yuan state. Immediately after the final conquest of the Song in 1279, orders went out across the empire. A vast, two-pronged invasion was planned. The First Fleet, the Eastern Route Army, would depart from Korea. It would be a smaller force of around 900 ships and 40,000 men, a mix of Mongols, Jurchens, Northern Chinese, and Koreans. The second, and far larger force was the Southern Route Army, to be assembled from the newly acquired resources of the former Southern Song. This was to be the main hammer blow, an immense fleet of 3,500 ships, carrying a staggering 100,000 men. The scale of the mobilization was breathtaking. The shipyards of southern China, particularly in the regions of Guangzhou and Quanzhou, were put on a war footing. Forests were cleared to provide timber. Every available craftsman, carpenter, and blacksmith was conscripted into service. The problem was one of speed and scale. Kublai, in his impatience, demanded the fleet be ready in just over a year. This impossible deadline had dire consequences for the quality of the ships being built. Instead of seasoned ocean-going junks, many of the vessels were hastily constructed, flat-bottomed riverboats, never designed to withstand the violent typhoons of the open sea. They were essentially floating barges, designed to transport men and horses, not to fight a naval war in hostile waters. Furthermore, the manpower for this grand fleet was drawn from the ranks of the newly conquered. The sailors and soldiers of the Southern Route Army were overwhelmingly former subjects of the Song Dynasty. These were men who, just years earlier, had been fighting a desperate war against the Mongols. Their loyalty was questionable at best, their morale likely abysmal. They were now being forced to build the very ships that would carry them into a new war for their conquerors, a war in which they had no stake. The entire enterprise was a logistical nightmare, a colossal undertaking held together by the sheer, unbending will of the emperor. It was a marvel of imperial power, but it was also a rotten and unstable structure, built on a foundation of haste, compromised quality, and the simmering resentment of a defeated people. As the colossal war machine of the Yuan dynasty ground into motion, its very scale and complexity created a host of secondary problems, the onions and vegetables that would poison the final kebab. Internal grumbling, once muted, grew louder within the Mongol elite. The traditionalists at court, already dismayed by Kublai's embrace of Chinese culture, saw this second Japanese expedition as the ultimate folly. To them, it was a profoundly un-Mongol venture. Mongols were horsemen, masters of the land, not sailors. This obsession with a remote island seemed a wasteful and dangerous diversion of resources away from the true heartlands of the empire in Central Asia, where rivals like Kaidu of the Chagatai Khanate were a constant threat. They whispered that the great Khan had been seduced by his Chinese advisors, that he was spending Mongol blood and treasure to fulfill a uniquely Chinese imperial fantasy. This internal dissent created a subtle but pervasive friction within the administration. Even more dangerous was the mood among the conquered peoples who formed the backbone of the invasion force. The Chinese of the South, who had just endured decades of brutal warfare, were now subjected to heavy new taxes and levies to pay for the fleet. Their sons were being conscripted to serve as infantry and sailors. For them, this was not a war of imperial glory. It was the brutal imposition of a foreign conqueror's will. The resentment was palpable. According to some accounts, there was even deliberate sabotage in the shipyards, with workers using poor quality wood or cutting corners in construction, knowing these vessels were meant for their new masters. The Koreans, who were tasked with building and supplying the Eastern Route Army, were also stretched to their breaking point. They had already borne the brunt of the first failed invasion, and were now being asked to contribute even more in ships, grain, and men. This immense strain fostered a deep and lasting bitterness. On a more personal level, Kublai was also dealing with family tragedies and the pressures of ruling a vast, complex state. His favorite wife, Chabi, and his chosen heir, Genghis, would both die in the coming years, devastating blows that would leave him an increasingly isolated and melancholic old man. All these factors, the dissent of the Mongol elite, the resentment of the conquered, the logistical strain, and the emperor's personal griefs, created a toxic undercurrent. The Grand Armada being assembled was not the product of a unified and enthusiastic empire. It was a project born of one man's will, imposed upon a fractured and weary populace. While Kublai's grand fleet was being assembled, The first cracks in the edifice of Mongol invincibility began to appear elsewhere, ominous portents of the storm to come. The myth of the unstoppable Mongol warrior, forged in the fires of Eurasia, was being tested and found wanting in the humid jungles and mountainous terrain of Southeast Asia. In 1277, Kublai launched an invasion of Burma, which ended in a Pyrrhic victory. The Mongols defeated the Burmese army and sacked their capital, but they were ravaged by tropical diseases like malaria, to which their steppe-bred bodies and horses had no immunity. The campaign was costly and ultimately failed to establish stable control over the region. Even more disastrous were the campaigns against Jai Viet, Vietnam, and Champa. The Vietnamese, under the brilliant leadership of the Tran Dynasty, proved to be masters of guerrilla warfare. They lured the massive Mongol armies deep into their territory, harassed their supply lines, and then used the terrain and the climate to their advantage. In a stunning naval battle on the Bac Giang River in 1288, the Vietnamese general Tran Hung Giao famously used iron-tipped stakes hidden beneath the high tide to impale and destroy an entire Mongol supply fleet, a tactic first used against the Chinese centuries earlier. These defeats were shocking. They proved that the Mongol war machine, so dominant on the open plains, could be defeated by a determined enemy using asymmetric tactics and knowledge of their home environment. These were not minor border skirmishes. They were major military embarrassments that cost thousands of lives and vast resources. Meanwhile, reports from spies and merchants confirmed that Japan was not sitting idle. Under the firm direction of Hojo Tokimune, the Japanese had engaged in a massive 7-year-long project to build a formidable defensive wall, the Genko Borui, along the coast of Hakata Bay. This stone barrier, stretching for miles, was designed specifically to prevent the Mongols from landing their cavalry and establishing a beachhead. The entire nation was on a war footing, its warrior class drilled and ready, its people united by the existential threat from the mainland. The harbingers of the storm were clear for anyone willing to see them. The empire's resources were being stretched thin, its armies were not invincible, and its enemy was disciplined, prepared, and waiting behind powerful fortifications. The fateful act, the final decision that set the colossal tragedy in motion, was the launching of the second invasion in the spring of 1281. The plan itself, born of Kublai's supreme overconfidence, was deeply flawed. It called for a two-pronged pincer movement, a strategy that had worked for him in the past on land, but which was infinitely more complex and dangerous at sea. The smaller Eastern Route Army was to set out from Korea first, link up with the massive Southern Route Army from China at Iki Island, and then proceed together for the final, overwhelming assault on Hakata Bay. The psychology of this era was rooted in hubris. Kublai and his commanders viewed the operation as a simple matter of logistics and overwhelming force, not a complex, combined arms amphibious assault against a prepared enemy. They failed to account for the unpredictable variables of weather, tides, and the immense difficulty of coordinating two massive independent fleets separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean. The first crack in the plan appeared almost immediately. The Southern Route Army, plagued by delays in shipbuilding and provisioning, was not ready to depart on time. The commander of the Eastern Route Army, impatient and perhaps seeking glory for himself, decided not to wait. He launched his attack independently, hoping to establish a beachhead before the main force arrived. This was a catastrophic violation of the core principle of the invasion strategy. The Korean and northern Chinese force attacked Tsushima and Iki Islands again, but when they tried to land on the mainland, they found themselves blocked by the formidable stone wall at Hakata. For weeks, they were stuck in a bloody stalemate. They could not land their cavalry, and their ships became a crowded, floating camp, vulnerable to daring night raids by smaller, more maneuverable Japanese boats. The samurai would row out under the cover of darkness, board the larger Mongol ships, kill as many as they could, set fires, and then retreat before dawn. The stalemate dragged on for nearly 2 months, a period of immense frustration and dwindling supplies for the invaders. Finally, in late summer, the massive southern fleet arrived. But instead of a coordinated, fresh assault, they found a weary, demoralized eastern fleet and a well-entrenched, determined enemy. The two fleets, a combined force of over 4,000 ships and more than 140,000 men, now crowded into the narrow confines of Hakata Bay, a floating city of chaos and confusion. The fateful act, the arrogant and poorly coordinated launch, had set the perfect stage for a disaster of unimaginable proportions. The greatest catastrophe, the apocalyptic resolution of Kublai Khan's grand obsession, unfolded over 2 days in mid-August, 1281. The newly arrived and massive southern fleet, combined with the beleaguered eastern fleet, prepared for a final, decisive assault. They were a terrifying sight, a forest of masts that choked Hakata Bay, the largest amphibious invasion force in human history until the Allied D-Day landings in the 20th century. But they were also a disorganized, unwieldy, and vulnerable target. The Japanese defenders, though vastly outnumbered, continued their relentless resistance from behind their stone walls and with their guerrilla-style naval raids at night. Then, on the night of August 15th, the sky began to change. The air grew thick and heavy, and the sea became unnaturally calm. Seasoned sailors knew this as the ominous prelude to a typhoon. What followed was not a storm, but a meteorological apocalypse. A super typhoon, which Japanese chroniclers would later name the Kamikaze, or divine wind, slammed directly into the bay. The full fury of the Pacific Ocean was unleashed upon the crowded, anchored fleet. The wind, reaching speeds of over 100 miles per hour, created a mountainous sea. The hastily built, flat-bottomed Chinese river junks were utterly helpless. They were smashed against each other, their timbers splintering with explosive force. They were lifted by colossal waves and thrown against the coastline, where they disintegrated into kindling. Masts snapped, hulls were breached, and thousands of men were swept into the churning water. The scene was one of hellish, unrestrained chaos. In the shrieking darkness, illuminated only by flashes of lightning, the screams of drowning men were swallowed by the roar of the wind. The larger, more seaworthy ships that tried to ride out the storm in deeper water were torn apart by the violence of the waves. Over the course of 48 hours, the most powerful invasion fleet ever assembled was systematically annihilated, not by the sword, but by the weather. When the storm finally passed, the bay was a grotesque graveyard of shattered wood, floating bodies, and broken dreams. Estimates suggest that of the 140,000 men in the invasion force, as many as 70 to 80% perished. Thousands who washed ashore were mercilessly cut down by the waiting samurai. The divine wind had delivered a victory more total and more terrifying than any army could have achieved. The legend of Japan's divine protection was born in this maelstrom, and the myth of Mongol invincibility died with it. The psychological and political fallout from the destruction of the Second Armada was immense and devastating. For Kublai Khan, sitting in his distant capital of Dadu, the news was not just a report of a military defeat. It was a personal and spiritual collapse. The sheer scale of the loss, the annihilation of over 100,000 men, the destruction of thousands of ships, the squandering of years of resources, was staggering. But the blow to his prestige was even greater. The man who saw himself as the son of heaven, whose will was supposed to reflect the cosmic order, had been utterly and publicly humbled by the gods of his enemy. The divine wind was a powerful narrative that spread like wildfire across Asia, cementing the idea that Japan was a sacred land, protected by its own deities who had intervened to destroy the invaders. This shattered the carefully constructed myth of Mongol invincibility and the universality of Kublai's heavenly mandate. The failure emboldened his enemies, particularly his rival Kaidu in Central Asia, who now saw him as a weakened and fallible ruler. Internally, the catastrophe gave voice to all the simmering resentments. The Mongol traditionalists saw it as divine punishment for his abandonment of the old ways. The Chinese and Korean subjects saw it as a pointless tragedy that had cost them their fathers, sons, and brothers. The economic cost was crippling, leading to inflation and popular unrest. For a time, Kublai, in a fit of rage and denial, began planning a third invasion. He ordered the construction of new ships and the levying of new troops. But this time, the empire resisted. His own advisors, reading the mood of the exhausted and demoralized populace, argued forcefully against it. The project was quietly and indefinitely postponed in 1286. There would be no third attempt. This was his last chance, and its abandonment was a quiet admission of defeat. The collapse was not just military but psychological. The energetic, ambitious conqueror who had unified China retreated into the shell of a grieving, isolated old man, haunted by the one failure he could never rectify. The winds of Hakata Bay had not just broken his fleet, they had broken his spirit. The finale for the great Khan was not a dramatic death in battle, but a slow, melancholic fading within the gilded cage of his own creation. The last years of Kublai Khan's life, following the Japanese disaster, were marked by personal tragedy and political decline. The death of his beloved wife, Chabi, in 1281, the same year as the typhoon, had robbed him of his closest confidant. The death of his eldest son and designated heir, Zhengjin, in 1285, was an even more crushing blow, throwing the imperial succession into doubt and leaving the aging emperor consumed by grief. He sought solace in food and wine, growing dangerously obese and suffering from gout and other ailments. He became a recluse in his magnificent palace in Dadu, the grand city he had built. A lonely emperor ruling a vast domain, yet haunted by his single, monumental failure. The fire of conquest that had driven him his entire life was extinguished. The disastrous campaigns in Vietnam and Burma continued to drain the empire's resources, while rebellions simmered in Tibet and Manchuria. He who had been the master of the world now struggled to hold his own empire together. His death in February of 1294, at the age of 78, was the quiet end to an epic saga. There was a profound irony in his finale. He was a grandson of Genghis, the ultimate nomad, who died in a fixed, opulent palace. He was a Mongol Khan who had become a Chinese emperor, and in the end, he seemed to belong fully to neither world. He was buried secretly, according to Mongol custom, in an undisclosed location in the Khenti Mountains of Mongolia. His body returning to the steppe homeland he had effectively abandoned decades earlier. His story, which began with the ambition to conquer the entire world, came full circle, ending with the private grief of a man who had gained everything but had been denied his ultimate prize by a force he could not command. The sea, the sky, and the unbending will of an island people. His last great act was not an act at all, but a quiet surrender to the ghosts of Hakata Bay. The legacy of Kublai Khan is a profound conflict of interpretations, a multifaceted story in which he is cast as a hero, a villain, a visionary, and an apostate, depending on who is telling the tale. To the Mongols, his memory is deeply ambivalent. On one hand, he was a great Khan who expanded the empire to its maximum extent, conquering the final and most difficult prize, China. On the other hand, he is often seen as the man who presided over the empire's fracture, the Khan who became Chinese. By moving the capital to Dadu, adopting Chinese administrative customs, and focusing his energies on ruling a sedentary empire, he is seen by traditionalists as having betrayed the nomadic soul of his people, diluting their warrior spirit and setting the Yuan dynasty on a path to eventual assimilation and collapse just a century later. To the Chinese, his legacy is equally complex. For centuries, official Chinese historiography treated him and the Yuan dynasty as illegitimate foreign conquerors, a period of national humiliation. He was the alien ruler who destroyed the refined Song dynasty. Yet, modern Chinese nationalism has increasingly reframed him. He is now often presented as a unifier of the nation, the ruler who brought Mongolia, Tibet, and other regions firmly into the Chinese sphere, laying the groundwork for the borders of modern China. He is celebrated as the Emperor Shizu of Yuan, a legitimate Chinese dynasty. But it is in Japan that his image is most stark and unambiguous. There, he is the archetypal foreign aggressor, the continental tyrant whose hubris was shattered by divine intervention. The failed invasions are a cornerstone of Japanese national identity, the foundational myth of the Kamikaze, the divine wind, which proved that Japan was a sacred land, uniquely protected by the gods and unconquerable by outsiders. This narrative of divine deliverance would be invoked for centuries, fostering a sense of martial and spiritual superiority that would have profound and often tragic consequences, echoing right up to the Second World War. Thus, Kublai Khan remains a deeply contested figure, a civilizing sage king to some, a foreign barbarian to others, and a defeated demon to a nation whose identity was forged in the act of resisting him. So we return to the central dramatic paradox, the core question that hangs over the wreckage of the Great Fleet. Why couldn't the heir of Genghis Khan conquer Japan? The final comprehensive answer is not a single point, but a fatal confluence of factors, a perfect storm of human error and natural fury. First and foremost was the sin of hubris. Kublai Khan, blinded by his unprecedented success in China and his belief in his own mandate of heaven, fundamentally underestimated his enemy. He saw the Japanese as dwarf pirates, failing to appreciate the martial ferocity of the samurai and the iron will of their leader, Hojo Tokimune. Second was geographical and technological overreach. The Mongol war machine was the most effective land army in the world, built on the synergy of horse and bow. This advantage was completely negated by the 115 miles of treacherous water separating Japan from the mainland. He was forced to become a naval power overnight, and the ships he built, especially for the second invasion, were a fatal compromise. They were not true ocean-going warships, but hastily constructed river transports, utterly unfit for the violent typhoons of the region. Third was the profound logistical strain and internal weakness. The empire, while vast, was not a monolith. The invasions were launched using the manpower and resources of a newly and brutally conquered people, the Southern Chinese, whose morale was low and whose loyalty was non-existent. The project was plagued by internal dissent and was simply too vast and too complex to be executed effectively, leading to the fatal lack of coordination between the two fleets in 1281. Fourth was the unyielding spirit of the defenders. Unlike many of the nations that had faced the Mongols, the Japanese had nowhere to retreat. It was an existential fight for their homeland, which, combined with the samurai code that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor, created a formidable and unbreakable resistance. But the final decisive factor was, of course, nature itself. Twice, storms of incredible violence intervened at the critical moment. While the Japanese saw this as divine intervention, the verdict of history sees it as the ultimate triumph of geography and climate over human ambition. In the end, Kublai was not broken by a single enemy, but by a coalition of them. His own arrogance, the limitations of his military technology, the resentment of his subjects, the courage of the samurai, and, most powerfully, the unpredictable and untamable fury of the sea and the sky. The universal lesson of Kublai Khan's life, the verdict of history, is a timeless and sobering one, the lesson of limits. His saga is the ultimate illustration of how even the most powerful empires, led by the most ambitious rulers, are ultimately bound by forces beyond their control. It is a grand historical drama about the eternal clash between human will and the intractable realities of geography, climate, and culture. Kublai represented the archetypal continental empire. Vast, multicultural, bureaucratic, and accustomed to warfare on endless plains where logistics and numbers were decisive. Japan, in contrast, represented the archetypal island fortress, compact, homogeneous, fiercely independent, and protected by its most powerful defender, the sea. The failure of the invasions was a brutal demonstration that a military doctrine perfected in one environment can be utterly useless in another. The Mongol cavalry, which had thundered across Asia and Europe, was impotent without a solid beachhead. The imperial will, which could command the construction of cities and the movement of 100,000 men, could not command the winds. Kublai's story serves as a profound cautionary tale against the dangers of hubris and the illusion of invincibility. It teaches that no mandate, whether from heaven or from a sense of historical destiny, is absolute. There are always coastlines that cannot be easily breached, cultures that will not be easily assimilated, and storms that cannot be predicted or withstood. The life of the great Khan is a testament to the fact that power has its own geography, its own gravity, and its own natural frontiers. His inability to conquer Japan was not merely a military failure. It was a fundamental encounter with the limits of empire, a lesson that would be learned and relearned by countless would-be conquerors in the centuries to follow. The final frame, the image that lingers long after the story is told, is not of the great emperor on his dragon throne in Dadu, nor of the chaotic inferno of the typhoon. It is a quiet, powerful image of the aftermath. On the shores of Hakata Bay, under a sky washed clean by the storm, stands a single samurai warrior. His armor is battered, his face is etched with exhaustion, but his posture is resolute. He stands amidst a coastline choked with the wreckage of 1,000 ships, a tangled graveyard of splintered masts, shattered hulls, and the lost banners of a world empire. The sea before him is calm now, almost placid, giving no hint of the fury it unleashed. He stares out at the empty horizon, where the last of the invaders' crippled ships has long since vanished. There is no triumphant cheer, only a profound, echoing silence, punctuated by the cry of gulls and the gentle lapping of the waves against the debris. This single, anonymous figure, standing guard over the remnants of a broken dream, becomes a silent testament to the entire saga. He is the personification of an island's defiance, the quiet symbol of a victory won not just by the sword, but by the stubbornness of the rock and the fury of the wind. The shadow of the great Khan, which had stretched across the known world, stopped here at the water's edge. The story of Kublai's ambition ends in this silence, a silence that speaks of the awesome, humbling power of the sea and the indomitable spirit of those who call its islands home.